Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about, are you doing Kriya Yoga correctly? Now, there are a number of different approaches in various Kriya schools. The particular practices that I teach for Kriya Yoga are the Panchanan Bhattacharya lineage of Kriya Yoga. And in this, one of the most important things that we learn at the beginning, obviously, is in breathing. It is a nasal breathing. Now, there are some particular schools, such as Self-Realization Fellowship, which use the mouth breathing. And the mouth breathing for Kriya is not as effective as nasal breathing. It is less efficient, for one thing. And to be able to get into that inner state, that pratyahara, the internalization, the nasal breathing is very effective for that. So breathe through your nose if you're doing Kriya Yoga. The second thing that is really important in Kriya Yoga is to slow your breath down. And one of the very effective means in yoga for slowing your breath down is something called Ujjayi breath, which means victory breath. And what it is it is engaging a epiglottal constriction. So inside your throat, you have an epiglottis, are narrowing the tube through which your breath flows. So this is an ingenious yogic practice, Ujjayi breath. Now, with regular breathing, if you're breathing through your nose, it's just fairly quiet. But when you do Ujjayi breathing, you start to hear a bit of an aspirated sound. And in fact, it's very hard for me after years of doing Kriya Yoga and doing intentional breathing not to make the Ujjayi sound. Constriction of the epiglottis is very subtle. Now, one of the ways, as I've said in other videos, that you can do this is that whenever you whisper, you are constricting your epiglottis. So if you start whispering, you're constricting your epiglottis. So what you can do is that you can practice whispering on the exhale, just like this. And you can practice whispering on the inhale, just like this. And that way you start to constrict the epiglottis and it creates the Ujjayi breath. Now, the advantage of the Ujjayi breath, because it constricts the epiglottis and it narrows the passageway from which air flows in your throat, is it can slow your breath down. So it means to take in the same volume of air through a more constricted passage, it takes longer time. So this is an ingenious yogic innovation, if you will. So to do Kriya Yoga correctly, you definitely want to engage in the Ujjayi breath as you're doing nasal breathing. So that's very important. Now, as I said, slowing down the breath is really important. And the reason for that is once you get your breath below a certain threshold of 7 breaths per minute, you start to get into a meditative state. And what happens is that, slowing down the breath will actually start to slow down the heart rate and so on. Sometimes people talk about doing Kriyas, like what is the rate for doing Kriyas, right? So some people will say, well, it's like about ½ minute per Kriya, or it could be longer or whatever. But basically you need to be breathing at 7 breaths per minute or less to be able to get into something that we call heart rate variability. And what that does is it starts to bring our heart rate and our breath into resonance with each other, right? So when we get this shift into our parasympathetic nervous system and we get into an internalized state. So you definitely want to get below that 7 breaths per minute threshold. And we have a guided video on our website, modernkriya.com, that has that guided, I believe it's at an inhalation of 4 seconds to an exhalation of 5 seconds. And so that will bring you to your 7 breaths per minute threshold, which will get you into heart rate variability and start to get you into a meditative state. Now, there's another thing about breath that is so crucial, and most Kriya schools don't teach it because they don't realize about it, because they don't know how Kriya works, right? But when you elongate your out breath, right, elongating the exhale to make it longer and slower than the inhale, you are engaging your parasympathetic nervous system through the dorsal vagal complex. So the dorsal vagal complex is a network of nerves that runs along the front part of your body. And when you do a longer exhalation than an inhalation, what you end up doing is stimulating that dorsal vagal complex. And consequently, it sends a signal to your medulla oblongata, which is in the brainstem, to slow down the heart rate. So this is a direct physiological response to this elongated out-breath. Most people in Kriya Yoga don't even know that. So if they're breathing at 2 breaths per minute, they'll inhale for 15 seconds and exhale for 15 seconds, making it very much this, the same length of inhalation and exhalation. What you want to do is increase the percentage of exhalation, right? So if you're doing this on your own and, say you're doing a two breaths per minute, instead of doing a 15-second inhalation and a 15-second exhalation, elongate your exhalation to 17, 18 seconds, and then your inhalation, shorten it by that. So you don't really have to count it, right? Because once you go below 7 breaths per minute, it doesn't really matter how fast you breathe. But if you make your out-breath slower and longer than your in-breath for the same volume of air, you're directly stimulating the dorsal vagal complex, you will stimulate the medulla, then it will slow down your heart rate. You will get into pratyahara, into internalization faster. So it is really a hack, if you will, to Kriya Yoga, or Kriya Yoga discovered this hack. And if you don't do this in your Kriya Yoga, do it, and you will find that it gets incredible leverage for your practice. Whereas instead of taking, 15 minutes or longer, it used to take many minutes to get into pratyahara. You can get into pratyahara in 5 minutes because you're doing the longer exhalation, right? So that's the other thing that to do Kriya Yoga correctly, you want to be able to get into pratyahara, right? Which is internalization. Now, what is internalization? Internalization is when your awareness goes inside. Now, why does it do that? It does that because you're stimulating your parasympathetic nervous system, which is like the relaxation response in your body. So when you go to sleep, your senses recede, right? You get into the parasympathetic nervous system. You are going into a relaxation response, you're resting, etc. In Kriya Yoga, you're doing this consciously without falling asleep and experiencing the benefits of that state, of that internalized state for meditation. So you want to get into pratyahara, right? So how do you know you're in pratyahara? Well, it's something called the galvanic skin response. So the symptoms of pratyahara are things where you can feel like your hands are hot and heavy or a tingling in your hands, right? You may feel a pulsation in your lower lip, right, as blood flows in and out. You may feel tingling up and down your spine, tingling throughout your body. Basically, any kind of tingling is an indicator that your parasympathetic nervous system is becoming predominant over your sympathetic. And when you start to feel those sensations, you know you're going inside, right? Things get very still. And as a result, you start to experience this internalized state, right? Your heart rate slows down. The whole system just goes to a very low idle and you get into this meditative state. It's really important, right? You want to be able to experience those signs of pratyahara. And if you're not experiencing signs of pratyahara, you're not doing your practice correctly, because you would experience those signs of pratyahara if you were doing your practice correctly. So, many of those tips I talked about in the beginning will lead you into pratyahara, which gets you into that galvanic skin response, that internalization, right? You definitely want that. Now, the other thing in Kriya Yoga that some schools don't do at all is Om Japa. Now, Om Japa is really important, right? Because this is where you're chanting Om in the different spinal centers as you're doing the Kriya Yoga breath. You definitely want to do that. And there's a number of reasons to do that. Some folks have talked about how it is, dealing with the projections of the mind in the chakras, what we sometimes will refer to as Samskaras, right? These karmic seed tendencies, things that disturb us in meditation. Om Japa is a way to help clear that. And so definitely, if you're not doing Om Japa in your practice, in your Kriya Yoga practice, you want to add it into your practice so that you're doing it while you're doing the Kriya Pranayama, right? It's really important. Now, the other thing, which is sort of the icing on the cake for Kriya Yoga, is something we call kumbhaka, right? Kumbhaka is breath suspension. So basically it means, in most cases, holding your breath. After you've inhaled, you're holding your breath. Now, holding your breath strategically at different times during pranayama, you can actually have an effect on your blood pressure. Now, when you hold your breath, your blood pressure goes up. So over a successive period of time, as you're doing the little breath suspensions, your blood pressure in general starts to go down. and you get to more shifted into your parasympathetic nervous system, becomes more dominant. So the breath suspension, they talk about the Yoni Mudra, right, which is something that we do in Kriya Yoga as one of these kumbhaka approaches, right, kumbhaka techniques. Just holding your breath at the top of the inhalation will do that. Now you want to be doing that in the right place. When you are doing your Kriya Yoga initially, you're not adding breath suspension at all. You are taking out the pauses between the breaths as you build your pratyahara, right? But once you get into pratyahara, into an internalized state, you can add the breath suspensions to get you deeper inside, right? It brings down, you've established this heart rate variability, right? Your heart rate has slowed down, right? When you're doing the Yoni Mudra, your blood pressure, in general, as a whole, will start to go down. And that gets you even deeper inside, right? Deeper into pratyahara. And basically the result of doing the kumbhaka, over time, and it doesn't happen in one session, but over time as you practice regularly, the result of that is that you will start to go into the tranquil breath, right? And the tranquil breath is not a practice, it's not taught, it's an effect, right? It's a result of the practice. And basically what happens is your breath starts to shallow out, right? You have less, basically once you've got into pratyahara and you've done your kumbhaka, and you're just sitting there and relaxing and you start to get very internalized, your breath starts to level out. It starts to get very shallow, right? The inhalation and the exhalation, and then it almost disappears, right? Because you've built up your carbon tolerance from doing Kriya Yoga and the breath suspensions over, many, it might be many weeks, many months, or years of practice, you have less need to take in as much breath. And so you can get into that tranquil breath faster. But the kumbhaka and breath holds are a very crucial part of that, right? So, the first chapter of Kriya Yoga, right, where you're doing the Kriya Pranayama and all that kind of thing, and you end with the Yoni Mudra, if you are at that point, when you're finished your particular pranayama practices and you're just sitting there in your meditative state, if your breath starts to kind of get very shallow and then level out, you have success in Kriya Yoga. That's where you want to be. That's what Lahiri said. Once you get into the tranquil breath, you're good, right? You're in your meditative state thoroughly, right? So that's really what you want is at a milestone, is that, you want to get the pratyahara, right? So you need to be able to get the pratyahara, you need to be doing all the practices properly, right? Then you add to your pranayama, you add the kumbhaka, right? The Yoni Mudra. Then the effect of that is the tranquil breath, and you get into the tranquil breath, you're good. You're doing your Kriya Yoga properly. And if you're not getting there, there's something lacking in your technique and you're not doing it correctly. And the quicker you get into tranquil breath, you've mastered Kriya Yoga, right? At least that level of Kriya Yoga, because that's really where you want to go, is into the tranquil breath, right? So, if any of those things are missing, you want to add those into your practice. Nasal breathing, the ujjayi breath, the slowing down of the breath to 7 breaths per minute, the freeze response or pratyahara, and the kumbhaka breath holds, getting into the tranquil breath, those are all such essential parts of Kriya Yoga that if you're missing those components, you're not doing your Kriya Yoga correctly. So if you're not sure about these practices as I've described them, you've been doing Kriya Yoga and you're like, okay, I'm not sure what you're talking about, feel free to send me an email at info@modernkriya.com. Also check our website at modernkriya.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.